In the land of wind and grit, long after the gold rush had turned to dust and footsteps had faded beneath the sand, Silas Merrick lived in quiet company with the breath of his horse and a spare bowl on the table, waiting for someone who would never return. No one remembered his name until the storm brought 5 orphaned children, eyes full of dust. Then something stirred back to life without needing to bloom. No one called him father, but in a dream, a child asked, "Are we home yet?" At the end of a red dirt road where no one ever turned, where grass leaned sideways in the wind as if too weary to stand, sat an old timber ranch house hunched beneath the breath of the western plains. Silas Merrick lived there, alone. The townsfolk called him Dustman because he never smiled, never spoke, and never sowed a single seed. They said he was useless, lived too long without a child, didn't shed a tear when his wife died, just dug the hole, filled it, and walked back inside like it was a barn animal he'd buried. Younger folks called him that poor barren fool. The older ones just shook their heads. "He's got nothing worth holding," they'd say. Even the grocer often miscalculated, forgetting he never bought for more than one. Only Belle, the old mare, shared his days. Every morning he'd carry the water bucket past her stall, murmuring a few words. Not affection, but more like a ritual, to tell her and maybe himself that they were still here, still standing. Inside the timber kitchen, the air always held the scent of old smoke and half-dried cloth. A hand-built table, 2 worn wooden chairs pressed side by side, and 6 bowls. Only one was ever used. One more for Belle, though she never ate indoors, and 4 others, clean and empty, always placed neatly along the edge. Then there was the 6th, set out at every meal across the table from where he sat. He never looked at it while eating, never wiped it down, never used it. It simply was. Each evening, as he tore bits of cornbread onto a tin plate, he'd reach beneath the cabinet, where nothing else lived but a few old wooden spoons, and take out that 6th bowl. No one knew why. Only he did, and even he no longer gave it a name. One afternoon, the wind shifted early. Silas was lowering the awning when the red dust storm rose from the distance, streaking the sky like a blade glazed in dried blood. Wind screamed through the gaps in the door, rapped against the tin roof, dragging leaves and sand. He sat at the table, brushed dust from the iron spoon, and laid the cornbread at the center, just enough for one. But still, he poured water into 2 bowls, one for himself, one for the shadow he no longer named. Belle stood under the eaves, hooves tapping steady like a heartbeat echoing through the home. The western light slanted through the frame, touching the empty bowl. It wasn't shiny, it wasn't new, it didn't glisten, but it stayed there, as if someone might still come. Silas never opened the east window, not out of fear of wind, but because on that side was the grave, and every man needs one place where no one can see him when his heart finally breaks. They whispered behind his back, "Old man's got nothing to leave behind, lives like stone." Another would reply, "Stone at least holds shape, that one ain't held on to a soul." Silas never answered. Perhaps he never heard, and if he had, he let it pass like sand across the eaves. But each night, when he washed the last bowl, he washed the 6th one too. Slowly, though it held not a single crumb. In a place no one noticed, within a house no one wished to enter, a man lived each day as if someone might still return. He wasn't waiting, but he kept the place, not out of belief, not quite habit either, but something left behind after everything else had gone. An upturned bowl, an empty chair, a word never spoken. These things no one understood, but they remained, long enough for the wind to turn. Each morning when the wind was still and the birds had yet to stir, A pale light from the east would try to slip through the slats Silas had nailed crosswise over the window. It wasn't a harsh light, just warm, faintly golden, like it was asking, "Have you forgiven yourself today?" But Silas never answered. That eastern window used to be where his wife, Annie, stood in the early hours, hand brushing her skirt, hair loose down her back, watching the chickens bob their heads in the red dirt yard. When the sun climbed over the ridge, she'd lift a hand to shield her eyes and smile, just a sliver, like it was her way of saying good morning to the world. Now that light no longer made it through. After her death, sudden, bitter as frost, Silas sealed the frame shut with nails and boards, not to keep the wind out, but to keep out the kind of light that could make a man remember. The sound of his own horse's hooves, coming 1 hour, 1 minute, too late. That year the snow came early. Annie had gone out to search for Scout, the half-wild dog they'd raised since it was a pup. Not yet a year old. Scout wouldn't come into the barn, kept running toward the woods. It should have been Silas who went. But he'd been fixing the roof of the grain shed, stacking hay, worried the storm would rip the cover off. Annie didn't wait. She just wrapped a red wool scarf and whispered, "I'll be right back." He nodded, didn't even turn. He thought she'd come back. Who would have thought the snow would fall that fast? Who would have thought that little red scarf would be the last color he'd ever see of her? They found her the next morning, curled beneath a sapling near the back field. Scout lay beside her, breathing, alive. She wasn't. No one blamed him. Folks said, "Amen." No one saw it coming. That storm hit hard. The county recorded it as an accident. The preacher said, "God chooses his ways." Neighbors brought firewood, left pies. Everyone meant well, but some things others might forgive, a man never does, especially a man who once heard, "I'll be right back," and didn't turn around. From that day on, the east window stayed shut. Their wedding photo was taken down, wrapped in burlap, and tucked into the wooden drawer beneath the bed. Silas never brought it out, never spoke of it. He kept on living, like a gardener tending soil where nothing would grow. Every year he patched the roof 3 times, but he never touched the window frame. One night, a storm ripped the planks loose. He sawed new wood and nailed them tighter, layer upon layer, until no light could pass through. Some said he was stubborn. Some said he lived like a man under judgment. But the truth was, some folks survive, not because they're strong, but because they're the last one left. No one else to bury the dead. No one else to tend the door. No one else to carry out what remained undone. Belle, the old mare, passed by that shuttered window every morning. She'd stop, glance toward it, like waiting for someone to draw back the curtain, then move on, hooves tapping against the dry ground. Silas had never taught her that, but old animals often understand the things people won't say. And on one morning, 10 years later, when a child first stepped up to that window, lifted a sleeve, and wiped the dust from the glass, the eastern light spilled into the old kitchen for the first time in a decade. It fell straight across the table, touched the 6th bowl, and glinted against Silas's face, still as if he'd heard something spoken he didn't dare believe. He stood at the basin, water dripping from his sleeves, to the wooden floor. He didn't turn. He didn't stop the child. He just watched the light fall across the table, as if seeing someone long gone. Not with his eyes, but with whatever was left of his heart. For 10 years he hadn't let the light in, but now someone else had opened it for him, and the light no longer hurt the way it used to. That afternoon there was no sun. The earth cracked in fine lines, like the hands of an old man dried too long by time. The grass hovered somewhere between life and death. A few strands bent toward the southwest, telling that the wind was turning. Silas Merrick was mending a length of fence, left hand holding nails, right hand swinging the hammer, steady as he had for 10 years. Belle, the old mare, stood beneath the twisted tamarisk, her tail swaying in silence, eyes fixed toward the horizon, as if listening to something he could not hear. The first gust brought no scent, only dust, fine and dry as ash, sifted through the pale light. He looked up. In the sky, a gray streak stretched west to east, like a tear in the fabric of heaven. The wind howled, not the howl of summer, but the growl of something older, a wind that had passed over blood, over stone, over places where men had once fallen. That kind of wind could not be mistaken. He knotted the wire, slung the hammer across his shoulder. Just as Belle began backing toward the barn, the old horse had never feared the wind. But this time, she didn't wait to be called. She turned, sure-footed with some ancient instinct, and made her way toward the wooden walls and rusted roof. Silas opened the barn door and said softly, "Go on in, girl," then slid the bolt, not tight but firm. The second gust hit sideways across the yard, like someone dragging the edge of a plow blade across the earth. Dust lifted from the bank, fine, fast, and sharp as paper knives. He ducked low, shielding his eyes, and made his way back, past the shed, past the well, each step heavier than the wind, one hand clutching his hat, the other gripping the doorknob he'd just closed. The wood groaned beneath his fingers, a quiet warning from nature itself. Inside, smoke still lingered from the stove. He'd reheated the morning's cornbread but hadn't eaten. On the table, the sixth bowl sat, still empty, turned down beside his own. Then the wind began tapping the boards, like fingernails rapping lightly on a coffin lid. There was something in that rhythm that made him stand. Not fear, but reflex, the kind that belongs to a man who's lived with loss. A man who's buried the one he loves beneath snow doesn't take lightly to strange sounds in the wind. He moved to the northern window, pried a sliver open, just wide enough for a thumb. Nothing but dust, a swirl of gray, yellow, red, dragging across the yard like a river of living mud. Then he heard it. At first it was like wood creaking, or maybe the bell rope catching in the wind, but then it repeated, a sound, thin, frail, stretched long, like the weak cry of a lost animal. Sometimes like a whisper, sometimes breaking apart like the last breath of someone dying of thirst. Silas froze, the house too still, the wind too wild, and that sound wasn't wind, couldn't be. He stepped onto the porch, raised a hand to shield his face. The wind slapped him hard. Sand wormed its way down his collar. The sound again, clearer now, a trembling noise, sharp but soft. Someone crying into the sand. Was it a trick, a memory echo, or... He turned back, reached for his heavy coat, wrapped it over his head and mouth. One hand gripped the storm lantern, the other a steel rod, not for defense but for finding his way. The wind tried to shove him back. He pressed forward, not fast, but without pause, near the rear of the shed, where a shelf of rock split open into a shallow pocket. The wind hiccuped, like something inside was holding its breath. He lowered the lantern, bent low. The yellow light carved through layers of dust hanging in the air like tobacco smoke. And there, tucked into a narrow hollow, was a small figure, thin, wrapped in a torn blanket, hair matted with grit, face hidden beneath a bony arm. Silas dropped to one knee. Careful. The child opened its eyes. Dust clung to the lashes. Its mouth moved. No words came. A tiny hand rose, trembling, and pressed something into his palm, a round stone smudged with a smear of red rouge. No one had taught the child to do that, but it did. Silas didn't speak. He simply held the child's hand. Then, with all the strength he had, he lifted that small body, turned his back to the wind, and ran. The wind behind him howled, this time like someone screaming into his ears. He didn't turn, didn't need to. because in that moment he knew. The wind had brought him something he never dared pray for, a voice without words, a sign heard by no one else, a soul halfway between dust and death had reached out to him. Belle struck her hoof against the stall door as he opened it, her head jutting into the dust storm like she was calling him home. Silas stepped onto the back porch, the hem of his coat shielding the child's head. Its breath was thin, like someone sleeping on the edge of death. He laid the small body by the fireplace, the old quilt of his late wife tucked beneath its back. The kitchen flushed orange with firelight, the smell of ash and sweat mingling in the air. He turned to fetch water from the shed when he heard a faint rustling. Not the wind. Footsteps. More than one. Silas stood still. The fire popped. The wind clawed at the walls. But something was moving outside the door. He lit another storm lantern, gripped the iron rod, and cracked open the back door. The wind still tore in long gusts, but weaker now, as if it had said what it came to say. The lantern's light cut into the dark and caught a pair of eyes. Then another. 5 children, huddled as one, coated in dust and grit, eyes wide, not crying, not screaming. They didn't come forward. They didn't run. They simply watched. One stepped forward, likely the oldest, took the hand of a younger one, and guided the remaining 3 behind. They didn't ask to come in. Didn't point. Didn't speak. The smallest stepped up slowly, looked at him, then opened a tiny hand. There, another stone, also marked with red rouge, also dusty, but gleaming faintly under the lamp like dried blood. It didn't offer the stone. It placed it in his hand, then gently folded his fingers shut, as if entrusting him with something more important than itself. Silas looked down at the stone. It had no value, except for what it meant. Why this child was still alive. No one gives a child something like that unless it's the last signal of an adult who couldn't make it. He looked up. The children stood motionless, hand in hand, covered in storm dust like salt. None older than 10. No visible wounds. But every pair of eyes looked like his at 50, on the morning he lost something he could never reclaim. Silas didn't ask, didn't demand explanations, didn't say, "Where are your parents?" or "Why are you here?" He simply gestured with his hand, turned inside, and left the door unlatched. The first one to step in wasn't the child who gave him the stone, but the smallest, still clinging to an older sibling's hand. They crossed the threshold like returning souls, hesitant, careful, but without fear. The wind behind them shifted, like a chapter closing, and in the glow of the hearth there was no more crying. Silas added wood, stirred the fire. One child curled close to the flames. One held the youngest. Another shut their eyes, like they'd lived through 10 sleepless nights. He walked to the table. The 6th bowl still sat there, untouched. Silently, he fetched 5 more, brushed the dust off, and placed them on the worn wood. No spoons, no forks, but cornbread, already sliced. The children didn't rush. They simply moved closer. Each reached out to touch a bowl, like touching something they didn't dare believe. No one said, "This is dinner." No one said, "You're allowed to stay." There were no promises, only fire, cornbread, 6 filled bowls, and a kitchen no longer empty. Before he turned off the lantern that night, the smallest child slipped the rouge-stained stone onto the old altar where his wife's photo once sat. No one told them to do that. No one knew why. But by morning, the eastern light crept through the board cracks and landed right on that stone. The windmill ranch was quieter than usual the next morning. The wind still moved, but no longer wild. It slipped through the plank seams like the breath of an old man sleeping. Silas rose from the wooden chair beside the stove, where he'd nodded off all night without truly sleeping. His legs were stiff, his back hard as if pressed in stone. But the heart, something in it felt softer. The children, 5 of them, lay huddled near the fireplace. None slept apart, their hands still clasped even in sleep. The old quilt he'd left had somehow spread across them all. Likely the older girl had pulled it over her siblings. The room held no crying, no murmured dreams, just the snap of firewood and Belle's soft snoring in the barn. He stood and poured water. The stove had gone cold. Last night's tea sat dry at the bottom of the kettle. On the table, the 6th bowl had been cleaned. Who had done it, he didn't know, only that it wasn't him. And that was enough to make him pause a moment, as though he'd touched something delicate. When he stepped onto the porch, the morning wind touched his face like ash, without dust, without message, only the scent of earth, and far off, the faint smoke of someone lighting a fire before dawn. No rooster crowed, not because they were dead, but because there hadn't been chickens here since his wife passed. Only Belle and him, and the cold bowl of rice at day's end. His eyes swept the yard. Small footprints pressed faint into dry dirt. Some trailed in zigzags like someone running. Others sank deep as though someone had stood still for a long time. All led to the old storage shed, where just yesterday he'd found something no one could have expected. When he stepped back inside, he saw the older girl, maybe 9, standing at the eastern window. That window had been nailed shut 10 years ago after his wife died in the freeze of a cruel winter. When he knew she wouldn't make it, he'd taken a saw to the boards himself and sealed the frame. Not to keep out wind, but because he couldn't bear the light slipping into the space where she once stood. Now the girl stood there, holding a damp cloth, wiping the dust from the glass. At her feet sat a bucket of water, drawn from the well before sunrise. She didn't look at him, didn't ask, "Is this allowed?" She just cleaned. Her hand moved over the wood grain. The dust of 10 years, thick as memory, was lifted bit by bit. Each stroke made clearer the outline of a house once alive, where laughter had lived, a wedding photo once hung, where tiny shoes had waited by the door. Come winter. Silas stood behind her, said nothing, didn't approach. He simply placed a hand on the frame, where the light had begun to slip through the first clean pane. The eastern light, pale gold, soft as breath, poured into the kitchen. Not harsh, not blinding, just enough to show the dust swirling in the air like small memories awakened. The girl finished, set the cloth on the table, and walked away. No word. Silas didn't stop her. He lingered a few moments more, watching that light spread across the table, across the stitched cloth his wife once made, across the bowl cleaned sometime in the night. No one mentioned the bowl. No one asked who had cleaned the window, but the house, once sealed against the light, was no longer resisting. That morning, for the first time in a decade, Silas lit the fire with his bare hands, not because it was cold, but because someone needed the warmth. No one said, "From now on, we live here." No one spoke of the future, but that morning when Silas sliced cornbread with his old rusted knife, a child quietly placed a bowl before him. No eye contact, no smile. Just set it down and stepped away, as if it had always been their place to do so. The day moved on like water sliding over stone. Silas hauled water, same 2 old iron buckets. But now the well no longer echoed his voice speaking to no one. When he washed his hands, he heard small footsteps pass behind. When he fed the stove, a small hand reached in and turned the kindling he'd just laid. No one said thank you. No one said let me help. Things simply happened, as though they'd already been written into the rhythm of life. At noon, Silas stepped onto the porch and saw one child sweeping the yard. The broom was longer than the child. Each sweep of dust overlapped old footprints with new. They didn't ask if he was pleased. They just did it like this was already home. Without discussion, without promise, by Belle's stall, another child was stacking straw. Didn't know if it was clean enough, didn't know if the horse would like it. But Belle lowered her head and ate, without kicking the walls like she usually did. The barn door that once hung crooked was now propped straight with a stone. A leaky bucket had been patched with cloth. Old rags gathered into a neat pile. No one told them to. It wasn't magic, just the breath of people, flawed, unfinished, learning how to breathe under the same roof. One evening, as Silas repaired an old saddle strap, the older girl brought over a handful of beans, peeled and cleaned, for planting next season. She didn't say it, but her eyes did. He took them, didn't nod, just stared at them like they were gold. In the kitchen corner, a small child drew on the wall using charcoal, a house, a man beside a horse. Beneath them, a line of children, faceless, just marks. Above, a sun, not a full circle, just an arc rising from the east. Silas watched for a long while, didn't correct it, didn't scold, just fetched a small nail, tapped it beside the drawing. Below the nail he hung a piece of dry wood, carved with a single word, "Here." No one asked what the word meant. No one said whether the drawing was good. But that night, all 5 children slept beneath his late wife's old embroidered cloth. The fabric faded, but still soaked with the sweat of someone who had once loved and once been lost. The next morning, one child wiped the table. Another split firewood. Another shucked corn, spreading husks across the roof like real village folk. They didn't call him anything, not father, not sir. They simply lived, as if they'd never lived another way. And Silas, a man who'd once believed himself nothing more than the husk of a man, began to hear his own breath sound different. No longer rushed, no longer hollow, but steady, like the sound of a horse sleeping by the door. Winchine, 3 days after the first child washed a dish, and the little girl hung corn husks along the roof, the sound of unfamiliar hoofbeats echoed from the south. Not Belle, not the clatter of a wagon passing through town, but the slow, deliberate thud of iron shoes, pressed deep, unhurried, as if the rider believed he had the right to go wherever he pleased. Silas heard it from the barn. He didn't change his shirt, didn't wipe his hands. He just unhooked the hammer from the wall and slipped it into his belt. Not in defense, but to remind himself he still knew how to use his hands. The man came riding a jet-black horse, proud gait but without haste. A dark coat, gloves on both hands, face clean of dust, as though he'd stepped out of a storefront, not crossed any field. He didn't greet, just cast a glance toward the porch, where the 5 children played near the haystack. He dismounted, pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his coat, held it up, not too high, as if words were unnecessary, as if lifting it was enough to be obeyed. He spoke, his voice thin as a razor's edge. "I come from Reverend Black Hollow Ranch. These children left that place. I am their legal guardian." He didn't ask for Silas's name, didn't ask if the children were fed or safe. He looked at them the way one examines misplaced merchandise. The children gathered as he approached. One clutched the back of Silas's shirt. Another stood close to Belle, and the old mare, who had never kicked a soul, lashed her tail so hard that dust spun into the air. The children didn't cry. They drew inward like birds who'd once had their wings stepped on. Silas didn't read the paper, didn't reach to shake a hand. He poured more tea from the kettle, lukewarm now, then leaned against the doorframe, stood tall, and looked eastward, where sunlight crossed half his face. He spoke just one sentence, slow, clear, not loud. "They're not dogs, and my house ain't a stable." The man stood silent, Not flustered, just tilted his head slightly, as though Silas were the one confused about roles. "I'll return," the man said, "with someone who holds greater authority." Then he turned his horse, unhurried, dust curled under hoof, but none reached the porch. The children didn't speak. The smallest one clutched Silas's hand, for the first time, not out of fear, but as if to keep him from falling into the place they'd once known. A place of silence and invisibility. That night, for the first time in a decade, Silas left the front door open. Not because he was expecting anyone, not because Belle liked the breeze, but because he wanted. If anyone ever needed to run, like those children once did, they wouldn't have to knock. The next morning the sky hung gray like a canvas tarp stretched over the roof of the ranch. No wind, no birds, no smoke. Silas rose early, didn't light the stove. He stood on the porch, holding a scrap of cloth, the same kind his wife used to wipe the eastern window pane. The children were still asleep. Belle hadn't whinnied. There was only him, and the silence left behind by yesterday. The man returned. Not alone this time. 2 other riders came with him. No badges, but their posture carried the scent of authority wrapped in wool. They didn't dismount, just halted at the fence, eyes sweeping the land as if it were something to be cleared. The man held up the same worn paper. "We have legal right. If you don't comply, it'll be recorded." Silas neither stepped forward nor back. He slowly descended the 3 porch steps. The wood creaked beneath him like memories waking. He set a hand on the porch post, then gave a slight nod toward the kettle on the table. "Tea's cold now. If you need to write anything, there's paper in the kitchen." No threats, no rifle drawn, yet none of them moved. Even Belle, the old mare, stood square in the path, as if she understood. The children stood within the doorway's shadow, not hiding, not trembling, just still, like those who've already known what it feels like to be pulled from a place they didn't get the chance to call home. One child touched the post. Another placed a wooden bowl on the table, new, carved just last night by Silas's hand. No one said, "This is home," but every movement screamed it. The man folded the paper, not in defeat, but in the knowledge that he hadn't won. He tugged the reins. The horses turned. Dust followed their hooves, stirring the dry grass along the fence. None of them looked back, but something rode off behind their shoulders. The right to command with empty law. Silas turned without a word. He didn't shut the door. He simply pulled an old nail from the eastern wall, the wall that had stayed sealed for 10 years. He laid it on the table, not as a trophy, but as a closing line. From a life that no longer feared the light. That night the stove burned red. One child stirred a pot of beans with a wooden spoon. Another folded the cloth for the table. No one spoke of the men who had come. No one asked, "Will they return?" Only Silas, pouring a fresh cup of tea, sitting across from the 6th bowl, the final one. And when the first light of day came through, he whispered, not to anyone, but to the house itself, "We don't have to wait anymore, and we're not afraid of anyone taking them away." Carrick's general goods hadn't changed in 30 years. The floorboards still creaked, the doorbell still rasped, and old Mrs. Eunice still wiped her hands on her apron even when they were clean. That week Silas returned, his first trip in nearly a season. He carried an old cloth sack. Inside, a list written in the careful script of the oldest girl. Rice, oil, salt, soap, 1 bar of chocolate if there's enough. Mrs. Eunice looked up and squinted. "You're out of rice already. You used to stretch a sack through a whole season." Silas didn't answer, just handed over the bag, but in her eyes something flickered, as though beneath the dust she saw a man who was no longer just a shadow. "I heard you took in some children," she said, then added, without waiting for a reply, We got a new shipment of cornmeal, good for little ones. It wasn't praise, it didn't ask for thanks, but she tucked a small sack of brown sugar into his bag and didn't mark it in the ledger. On the walk home, Silas moved slower than usual. The road from town to the ranch wasn't long, but this time he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. A paper kite caught in the arm of a cactus, a small round footprint pressed into damp earth, not his, and somewhere in the distance a thin, drifting laugh, soft and unsure, but unmistakably real. No one ran out when he returned, but from the porch, the oldest girl looked up from where she was laying out corn husks and pointed toward the post where the sparrow had made its nest. "She laid eggs," she said, her voice barely above the breath of wind. The older boy helped carry the rice into the shed. Didn't speak, just counted the sacks, then marked on the wall with a piece of charcoal. 2 left. No one called him anything, not father, not Mr. Silas. But that night, as sleep settled over the house, the youngest girl murmured in her half-dreaming voice, "Are we home yet?" Silas heard, didn't answer, just pulled the blanket up over her shoulder. And for the first time, his hand didn't tremble when it brushed a child's hair. Outside, the insects sang, and the moon rose quiet and full, like a bowl of still water hung above the world. After that day, the folks in town stopped calling him that old man who lives alone. Now they said, "That fella out at the Windmill Ranch with the kids. Yeah, he's still there. He's all right." They didn't use his name, but he was no longer forgotten. That morning, Silas woke earlier than usual. The sun had yet to rise, but the warm scent of ash from the kitchen stove had already crept through the house. Small footsteps circled the floor, light as a bobcat's paws, scratching softly against the wood. He threw on his coat and stepped out to check on Belle. The wind was gentle. No hint of rain. Only a rare peace, as if the whole wild land was breathing beneath the same roof. When he returned, he noticed something fastened to the barn door, the plank long warped from years of wind and rain, a board he'd always meant to replace, but never did. It was a scrap of craft paper, torn at the edges, pinned with a rusty nail. Drawn in thick, smudged pencil strokes, clumsy but uncannily clear, was a picture, 6 figures standing beneath a sloped roof, beside a large horse, behind them the horizon, and a rising sun, round and radiant, like a glowing egg cracking the sky. Beneath it, in crooked block letters, "We are home." Silas didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply stared, long enough for the morning light to shift from fog gray to golden across the sleeve of his coat. He took the drawing down, gently, like removing a fragile twig he didn't want to break, and carried it into the house. He stopped before his wife's photograph, an old picture, its silver frame dulled by time and grief. He paused. Then, without a word, he unhooked the photo, not to put it away, but to lower it, to hang it near the empty nail beside the eastern window, where the light now streamed in, and at the highest point, he hung the child's drawing, not as a declaration, not as a replacement, but as a bridge between a past still aching and a present growing with every breath. The children didn't ask, but that morning the youngest walked up to the barn door, looked at the torn paper scar it left behind, then turned to Silas and said, "I'll draw another to hang there. Belle needs to know we're still here." Silas rested a hand on the child's shoulder, as soft as touching an eggshell. He didn't speak, just looked the child in the eyes as if to etch something deep inside them. Anywhere someone stays, that's home. And if we must, we'll redraw the whole world with our bare hands. Outside, the eastern light poured into the house, right into the corner he'd boarded shut a decade ago. But now there was nothing left to cover, only sunlight falling exactly where it was meant to. The first winter wind arrived without a sound. No thunder, no warning. Just that morning when Silas opened the door, the fog hung thick as wool, and the chimney smoke rose straight and white, refusing to drift. The ranch had changed, not in the leaves or the air, but in the traces of people. On the porch, the children hung dried corn husks shaped like wings. One molded clay lizards from dirt, setting them to dry on sun-warmed stone. Another folded newspaper into boats and floated them in a basin of rainwater, as if releasing something unseen. No one told them to do any of it. No one taught them how. Silas hauled firewood from the edge of the ravine. His back ached, his hands throbbed. But when he saw the oldest girl fumbling with a pile of logs, he set his burden down without a word. "Shift back a little." She understood, even without hearing the words aloud. Together they stacked the wood. Dry ends underneath, thick logs above, the way people stack it when they're not burning just for tonight. Inside, beside the stove, Silas reached for a scrap of old fabric, a cloth his wife had once used to wrap cornbread every weekend. The edges had frayed, the color faded, but it still held the faint scent of roasted husk, a smell that lingers longer than memory. He folded it carefully. The girl saw, didn't ask. She simply looked at the cloth as if it were something sacred. Silas handed it to her, not with words, just a slow nod, slow enough that it couldn't be mistaken for accident. That night, Silas didn't go out to the barn like usual. He sat in the kitchen, a warm tin cup in hand, watching the youngest draw with charcoal on the wall. The child wrote names not quite right, letters tilted and uneven, but they were the first names written in this house in 10 years. Jonah, then a space, then SS. Silas didn't correct it, didn't praise. He simply picked up the charcoal and wrote one more word beside it. And me. No one knew if the me meant Silas or meant the whole house. Maybe it meant both. That night, Silas sat watch at the door. Wrapped in a quilt up to his ears, he took the old chair and faced the dark. The children slept scattered near the hearth, like rays of forgotten sunlight left over in the dry, cold season. The snow hadn't come yet, but when it did, Silas knew this time he wouldn't face it alone. The sky that afternoon was dim and heavy. No wind, no snow, just a chill that hung in the air like ashes not yet cooled. Silas had a fire going in the yard, burning dry branches to clear the garden. The children wandered the edges of the ravine, some gathering wood, some picking wild seeds, some shaping animals from earth. The oldest girl, the one with eyes too distant for her years, stacked kindling in quiet lines, breathing steady, not clinging, just doing her part like someone who understood. Here, no one needed to earn their right to belong. Silas was filling in the ash pit, dirt clinging to his hands, when he heard footsteps on the porch, soft. No voice followed, just a presence, gentle as slow-moving clouds settling over the plains. Then came her voice, Papa Silas, not a shout, not said twice, just once. Soft, thin, but cutting clean through the long shadow of the past. Silas froze, hands buried in the dirt, eyes locked on the thin smoke curling up from the pit. His chest cracked, not from pain, but because the ice that had lived there for 10 years had just begun to thaw, like a spring river breaking open. The girl didn't linger. She said it, then turned back into the house, as if that word were no more remarkable than setting wood to flame. Just part of the day. Not needing reply. Silas looked down at his hands. Dry dirt clung tight, but for the first time they didn't feel cold. That night he sat by the fire and pulled out the wooden box, the one that held the letters his wife left behind. Scraps of paper with planting dates, worn photographs. For the first time he opened it not to read, but to take out a small piece of wool scarf, folding it once, gently. The next morning he tucked it into the oldest girl's pocket. "When the cold comes," he said, "use this first." No one spoke of the name she'd called him, but from that day on, everything in the house moved with the rhythm of those who were no longer strangers. They didn't call each other by name too often. They didn't hang the word family on the walls. But everyone knew. If one of them called just once, the other would hear. The wind shifted just after dawn. Not loud, but dry, slanted, cold as needles threading through the earth. The kind of wind that in the west never brings good news. Bell neighed 3 times. Short, sharp, spaced like warnings. Silas didn't need to look down the road. He knew. The man had come back. A black horse stood at the gate, its rider, black leather coat, new gloves, a pistol at the hip, was not alone. Behind him 2 others, one holding a red-bound ledger, the other, the town deputy. The man didn't greet, just raised a stack of papers above his head, like truth didn't require explanation. "I have a warrant." The wind flipped across the yard like a page from a book never meant to be read. Silas stepped out, hands empty. The light from the east cut across his face, half in sun, half in shadow. The man held out the papers. "These children are abandoned property. We're here to return them to state care." The children stood just behind the door. No screams, no scrambling, just one stepped forward and gripped Silas's hand. He gave the child's fingers a gentle squeeze, his eyes passing over the drawing still nailed to the barn. 6 figures, a horse, and the words, "We are home." Silas folded the paper, slipped it into his coat pocket, unread, then looked straight at the man, his voice slow, clear. "I don't leave anyone behind, not my own blood, not a child carried in by the wind." There was no applause, no crowd, just the way he stood, his hand resting on the child's shoulder and the eyes of those children, like trees too deep-rooted to sway. The man hesitated, looked at Silas, looked at the children, unmoving. He muttered something under his breath, turned his horse. Dust rose from the hooves, but none of it reached the porch. Inside, Silas sat at the table beside the 6th bowl. The oldest girl folded the court paper, creased it small like a paper boat. "I don't understand all the words," she said, "but I don't think we need to read it again." Silas nodded, ladled stew into each bowl. No one said, "Let's eat." But everyone ate every last bite. That night, Silas patched a child's coat using fabric from something old. "We don't need guns," he said. "We need warm clothes." One of the children took the wool scarf, wrapped it gently around his neck. Not tight, just enough to let him know he was being kept. They left the ranch 3 days later. No one said where. No one asked, "Why not stay?" Silas knew, the children understood. That black horse would return, and next time it might not come without violence. They didn't flee. They left to live, without always having to brace for what might come. They settled in a low basin near a dried-up lake, cracked earth, murky water, no people, but more importantly, no man's name, no warrants, no gaze that measured the worth of another human being. Silas raised a tent with wooden stakes, thorn rope, and an old tarp. The oldest child hammered the posts. The youngest weighed the flaps down with stones. They worked slow, not rushed, but steady like hands that had done this for generations. That first day they lit the stove with dry roots. The soup was thin, the water cloudy, but no one complained. No one left a drop behind. At night, Silas divided an old blanket, saving one strip just for Belle, who now slept closer to the tent than he did. The older girl laid her head on a cloth sack and breathed evenly. The smallest boy curled against Silas's back and whispered, "I don't miss the world out there much. Here we can live." Silas pulled the blanket up over the boy, his eyes drifting to the top of the tent. where moonlight spilled through a seam in the fabric, soft as the eastern light from another morning long ago. And he whispered, as if speaking to the wife he once buried, "Yeah, we can live." By next morning, the scrape of shovels filled the air. The children were digging bean holes. No orders given, no permission asked. The cracked soil opened, as if it, too, had once believed nothing could grow and was now ready to be wrong. One child planted a dry branch to mark a plot. Another tied string around the tent, making a small fence. The older girl took charcoal, drew a circle on a slab of wood. Inside it, 6 tally marks, one for each of them. No names, no family. Just this, it's enough. The wind rose, not with dust this time, just a breeze, the kind that brushes past places not yet marked on maps. Only a low canvas roof, the crackle of firewood, and the sound of children's laughter lifting from the hollow, like seeds cast into soil that had once been forgotten.